Well, you hear these words from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 18, starting in verse 17. The Lord said to me, this is Moses speaking, "What they say is good. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their fellow Israelites, and I will put my words in his mouth. He will tell them everything I command him. I myself will call to account anyone who does not listen to my words that the prophet speaks in my name. But a prophet who presumes to speak in my name anything I have not commanded, or a prophet who speaks in the name of other gods, is to be put to death. You may say to yourselves, how can we know when a message has not been spoken by the Lord? If what a prophet proclaims in the name of the Lord does not take place or come true, that is a message the Lord has not spoken. That prophet has spoken presumptuously, so do not be alarmed." On September 19th, 1796, 20 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence and 8 years after the signing and ratification of the Constitution, George Washington's farewell address was published for the country to see and to read. You see, Washington had opted to not run for a third term in office as president, setting a precedent then that would go on to last for 150 years and would later be ratified into a constitutional amendment. With 4 months remaining in Washington's presidency, he took some time to offer reflections on what he had learned and his final wisdom that he wanted to impart to this now not so young country that he had helped to form. In what has become an extremely significant document, significant historical document over the centuries since, this letter from a founding father and from the first president, Washington goes on to give his thoughts on a wide range of topics, on any number of things ranging from public education to national debt and international treaties and everything else in between. And Washington, in this letter, he seems to have a good amount of hope for this American experiment. He really does seem to be pretty optimistic about what the future is going to hold for America, and yet he was not unrealistic about the potential pitfalls ahead of them. Even as he wrote this letter in which, he urges against partisan politics and urges people to stay united, political factions were already forming. The two parties that would eventually turn into the Federalist and anti-Federalist parties, they were already taking shape as Washington was writing this letter. So while Washington was very positive and upbeat about what the future of America could be, he knew and was already witnessing and that there would be times and would be choices ahead of the American people that could definitely cause stumbling blocks for the growth and prosperity of the nation. The book of Deuteronomy is, at least in part, Moses' farewell address to the people of Israel. Moses recognizes that the people of Israel have now reached the promised land for the second time, and that God has made clear to Moses that he will not be leading the people into the promised land. And Moses, being in the prime of his life at the young and energetic age of 120 at this point, I'm sure is deeply disappointed that he is not entering the promised land. And yet he takes some time to still give the Israelites a final set of instructions, a final word from the Lord, from Moses himself, about how they are to enter the land and live while they're there. And remember, at this point, the entire generation that had previously made it to the promised land, that had refused to go in, they've now passed away. So Moses is now telling the stories and passing on the law to this young generation as one of the oldest people, probably the oldest person in the whole of Israel at that point. He is one of the final men to see and have lived and experienced and remember everything that took place in Egypt, all the miracles that happened, all the plagues that happened, and then even the disobedience and unfaithfulness in the wilderness. And so Moses is hoping to set the Israelites on a path toward faithfulness to God as they enter into the promised land and seek to have success in this new land. So today we finally conclude our time in the Torah. And I don't know about you, but as I even reach the end of this section of our year-long series, I'm even feeling a little bit overwhelmed at this point. I mean, there's a lot of information in the Torah. We've covered a lot of things, and we've overlooked a lot of things too. But we turn now to Deuteronomy today, the fifth and final book in the Torah. And we know this book as Deuteronomy. We call it Deuteronomy because of the Greek title of the book, Deuteronomion, which means second law. Now, it's not actually a different law than what we saw in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, but again, this is a new generation. The generation that originally received the law back in Exodus and Leviticus, they have all passed away now. And so this is an opportunity for the law to be given a second time and to be reiterated for this new generation of Israelites. Now, the original Hebrew name for the book is actually Devarim, which simply means words. Very creative title, I know. But this title emphasizes these final words of the leader of the Israelites, of God's mouthpiece to his people, of the prophet Moses. And so as we've discussed over these last few weeks, the Torah is all connected. It's all meant to be read as one unified literary unit. And so a part of the structure of that one unified literary unit is this device called a chiasm. And so what that means is, in order to emphasize certain themes, certain stories in the Torah, there's a somewhat mirrored image to the story itself. So Leviticus is the center point of the story. It's kind of where everything else points to and crosses paths in. And so, that's a book in which I really believe that's the point where God highlights the way that he intends to solve the problems that are caused in the other four books. This is, God's law to his people. We talked last week about just the Day of Atonement and just any number of other things that really do point to not only how God is working in the life of his people there and then, but then also begin to point toward Jesus in the way in which he will be the ultimate fulfillment of God's redemption of humanity and bringing us back to himself. So Leviticus, center point, really important, but then we've got the book of Numbers and the book of Exodus that reflect one another. And now today we have the book of Deuteronomy that reflects the book of Genesis. And we aren't going to dwell long on this point, but it's just something for you to consider as you read through these books. What themes, what stories do they share in common that are repeated throughout each of those books? I'll give you today what I would say are three of the most important ways in which the book of Deuteronomy reflects the book of Genesis. So first, both of these books are in large part focused on covenants. Genesis focuses on a covenant between God and the patriarchs. And then Deuteronomy focuses on a covenant now made between God and the descendants of the patriarchs. Second, then, there's an emphasis on how we should live in order to be in right relationship with God. Genesis makes this point through stories. Deuteronomy makes this point through explicit laws. Some of those explicit laws actually seem to me to be pretty directly pointing back toward some of the mistakes that were made in Genesis and offering a correction toward the stories that went wrong in the book of Genesis. And then third, the story of Genesis is the story of humanity being banished from the Garden of Eden, this perfect place of God's blessing where God and humanity can dwell together with one another in right relationship, and humanity wanders away from that promise. Deuteronomy, then, is the story of God's people leaving their desert wandering place where they're separated from God and entering into the promised land where they can experience God's blessing, the fulfillment of his promises, and pursue being in right relationship with God once again. So before we really get started in all of this, I say as we're already 10 minutes in, but whatever, not the point. But as we get started, though, this morning, want to reiterate the assumptions that we have as we work all the way through this series. We've got these two underlying assumptions. The first being that Jesus Christ is the gospel. Jesus is the good news. Jesus is the good news that we proclaim to the world. His life, his death, his teachings, his resurrection. He is the good news. And the second assumption that we have is that the Bible is a unified story that leads to Jesus. These 66 books that we find in the Bible are not just disconnected teachings from random guys over the course of several centuries, but instead they are an intricately woven together, beautiful story of God's relentless pursuit of humanity. And all of it declares, all of it foreshadows and points to Jesus in some way. And so throughout the course of this year, we're going to be looking at each book of the Bible through this specific lens to see how God is revealing himself in each and every book and pointing to Jesus in the process. Now, the book of Deuteronomy, this is not just a random speech given from Moses to the people, giving instructions to the Israelites before he dies. It's an incredibly strategically written document that has a striking, even undeniable parallel and resemblance to a covenant treaty from ancient times between a suzerain and their vassal. So what would happen in ancient times is a king or a nation would come in and they would either conquer or threaten to conquer a smaller territory, and then they would create a treaty with this people. The conqueror, known as a suzerain, would lay out stipulations for the conquered, their vassal, on how to stay on their good side and to live peaceably in this new kingdom that they are now being brought into. So Deuteronomy uses this kind of treaty as its outline, with the only real exception, deviating from that outline being at the very end. There's these songs and blessings from Moses found in chapter 32 to 34. But by and large, it is almost, point for point, a copy of what a covenant treaty would have been back in that day. So a covenant treaty like this, it would have had a preamble. Then there would have been some historical background on what led to this treaty happening. And then there would have been stipulations on the treaty. Then there would have been consequences of not following the consequence of not following or the blessings of following the treaty. And then there would be final oaths and witnesses to acknowledge the ratification of all of the things that just happened. And congratulations, you now know the outline of the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy has a preamble, just a few verses in chapter 1. Then there's a historical prologue in chapters 1 to 4, where we get some of the history of the relationship, certainly the recent relationship between God and his people. Then there are stipulations in chapters 5 to 11, and then there are details of those stipulations. So, like, the stipulations are given in chapters 5 to 11, but then they're expanded on in chapters 12 to 26, and this is the portion of the book that we see as the law. Then in chapter 27 and 28, there's blessings and curses, and then in 29 to 31, there's oaths and witnesses, and then, like I said, there's kind of an epilogue at the end from Moses. So the whole book of Deuteronomy, it's just one big covenant between God and his people, with God telling them exactly what it's going to take for them to live peaceably in the land and continue to be in good relationship with him, their true Lord and King. In Deuteronomy 1:6, Moses begins his recap of the history of the people of Israel. Specifically, he begins with the failure of the people of Israel. He tells the story of the last time that the Israelites made it to the edge of the promised land and then promptly decided that they were good in the wilderness, and they didn't want to try and enter. So Moses offers this cautionary tale of what happens when we aren't obedient to God, when we fail to do his will. And Moses then conversely tells stories of God's faithfulness despite the rebellion of the Israelites. The next few chapters then give the beginning of the law, why the law matters, what's important in it. The Ten Commandments are reiterated to the community. And as the Israelites understood the Ten Commandments, they basically were the summary statement of the entire rest of the law. Everything else beyond that, the other 603 laws that we get in the Torah, are basically summarized in the first 10 commandments. So if you keep the first 10, then you're going to keep the other 603. So the 10 commandments, that's kind of the baseline. And then the law gets extrapolated out from there as well. But there are more summary type statements given before the details of the finer points of the law start in chapter 12. And in the midst of those summary statements, I think there's one of the most beautiful and profound statements of the Old Testament, if not the entire Bible. Deuteronomy 6:4-5 says this: "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength." Even before the doctrine of the Trinity was even a glimmer in anyone's mind, God makes clear a foundational truth about who he is. He is one God who reigns supreme over all things. And the reason that this statement is so important is because in the stipulations in the expanded law, a lot of it is focused on how the Israelites are called to set themselves apart from all of the nations around them. And one of the most important ways to set themselves apart, to be faithful to God, was to remain faithful to their singular God that they served and worshiped. We take this for granted now, but in that day and age, Israel was the only monotheistic faith. The rest of the world just assumed that there were many gods who oversaw many different things. And Israel, as a result, worshipped very differently their single God than the many gods of all the other nations. And so God wanted them to not only remember this, but to make it central to who they were, to be reminded constantly of it. The Israelites were instructed to not only impress this commandment on their hearts, but then also to write it on their hands and their foreheads and their doorposts, and to teach it to all future generations. In terms of commandments, these two simple verses in Deuteronomy 6, they state the very core desire of the covenant for Israel to be faithful to their one single God and to God alone, and to worship and serve him with all that they have and all that they are. While the book could potentially have been shorter if they would have just summarized the law by saying, love and obey God, and then called it a day, that is obviously not what happens in this book. Moses goes on to remind the Israelites of how they are called to be faithful to this God that they serve. He gives them laws about tithing, about clean and unclean food, about the cancellation of debt every 7 years, about various festivals that they're to celebrate, about offerings, about going to war, and countless other things. And we'll circle back around in a minute to this section of the law, to the piece that I see as most central, most core to that. But the book continues after the law is given, and it then concludes with what the consequences will be of following or not following these commands from God. The blessings that God provides in chapter 28 are never about what Israel will or could do for themselves, but are solely focused on what God will provide if they're faithful and obedient to his commands. And the curses, likewise, are pretty brutal, but once again, Israel or the other nations, they are not the main actors in what will happen if they are disobedient to God's will. God remains the main actor and makes clear that he will be the one to bring about the curses that would be inflicted on Israel, because they're not honoring him. They're not treating him as truly sovereign and truly king over their nation. I'll read just one of the many sections in Deuteronomy 28 where Moses tells them what will happen, what God will do if they don't honor the covenant with them. So again, this is a whole chapter. This is just one section of it, though. So Deuteronomy 28, 58 to 63 says this: "If you do not carefully follow all the words of this law which are written in this book, and do not revere this glorious and awesome name, the Lord your God, the Lord will send fearful plagues on you and your descendants, harsh and prolonged disasters and severe and lingering illnesses. He will bring on you all the diseases of Egypt that you dreaded, and they will cling to you. The Lord will also bring on you every kind of sickness and disaster not recorded in the book of the law until you are utterly destroyed. You who were as numerous as the stars of the sky will be left but few in number, because you did not obey the Lord your God. Just as it pleased the Lord to make you prosper and increase in number, so it will please him to ruin you and destroy you. You will be uprooted from the land that you are entering to possess." And honestly, folks, that's one of the more violent parts of that chapter. It gets pretty graphic and pretty intense at some points, these curses that God promises to bring upon them. But at least to a point, this is how all kings dealt with their subjects in these kind of covenant treaties. Now, the difference between God and other kings is that God is less corruptible and much more consistent and faithful to uphold his part of the deal than other human kings were. But still, this is how these master-servant covenant relationships went. It was par for the course in that day. If you're faithful to the one that you serve, you can expect blessings and prosperity. But if you disobey, just be prepared for all hell to break loose. And I use that word very intentionally, especially in the context of this covenant between God and Israel. But here's the really fun part about the ending of the book of Deuteronomy. even after all the stories, even after all the law has been given, even after all the blessings and curses have been offered, even after the people of Israel accept this covenant that God has offered, is offering them, God and Moses are still comically pessimistic about how well this is going to go. And part of me really does get that. I mean, God and Moses have been walking with and watching these people be hard-hearted and stubborn for the last 40 years and seeing this nation mess up time and time again. So how could they not be a little bit pessimistic about how this is going to go? Deuteronomy 31:16-18 says this, "And the Lord said to Moses, you are going to rest with your ancestors, and these people will soon prostitute themselves to foreign gods of the lands they're entering. They will forsake me and break the covenant that I made with them. And in that day, I will become angry with them and forsake them. I will hide my face from them, and they will be destroyed. Many disasters and calamities will come on them. And in that day, they will ask, have not these disasters come on us because our God is not with us? And I will certainly hide my face in that day because of all their wickedness in turning to other gods." Notice that entire passage. It's not, this might happen. It could happen. There's a strong chance it's going to happen. It will happen. God is making a declaration that he knows that the people are going to fail. God knows that this isn't going to work. And so to me, as a Christian, looking back on this historic tradition that the Israelites have started in our shared scriptures that we read together, I read this in such a way that actually makes a lot of sense. For the Israelites to not fully grasp the law, to not fully live up to their end of the deal, God knew that no matter what he did, humanity was going to continue to fall short of God's desire for us. And that's why Jesus, a more permanent solution, was so necessary. And I believe that the book of Deuteronomy points to this very clearly. So like I promised, we need to circle back around to the center section of the book, to all of the laws, especially as we look for where Jesus is present in the book of Deuteronomy. And just like last week, the book of Deuteronomy, beautifully crafted, intricately laid out, and of course we find Jesus at the very center point of the book. Chapters 16, 17, and 18 addresses three types of leadership that God is instructing for the people of Israel to maintain. So there's three roles. There's there's the role of judge, of king, and of prophet. And while each of those are absolutely instructions that are given to real people in real time and to the people of Israel for this specific role throughout their history, I also believe there's evidence to say that these three roles actually, we're meant to see the Messiah. We're meant to see Jesus through these three roles. So first, we've got Deuteronomy 16, 18-20 that says this. It says, "Appoint judges and officials for each of your tribes in every town that the Lord your God is giving to you, and they shall judge the people fairly. Do not pervert justice or show partiality. Do not accept a bribe, for a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and twists the words of the innocent. Follow justice and justice alone, so that you may live and possess the land the Lord your God is giving to you." So the first kind of leadership that God is offering to the people is that of a judge. And this is not the first time that judges are described throughout the Torah. In Exodus 18, judges are appointed. And the expectation, I think this is a really interesting piece about the judges. The expectation of them is not that they are legal experts who passed Torah school and know the Torah perfectly and all of those things. They didn't achieve the highest grades necessarily, but instead, the expectation is that the judges are men of incorruptible character, men who will judge fairly, who will not accept bribes, and will not allow the status of the lowly to be taken advantage of. Second, then, in Deuteronomy 17, the expectations of a king are described. And the long and short of that passage is that not only should the king set himself apart from the people, but he should recognize that he is not actually the leader of the Israelites. He is not the actual king. He is instructed to keep a copy of the law with him at all times and to reflect and meditate on it and to remember that it still applies to him as well. The king of Israel is not to be a tyrant or a dictator, but instead the chief example of what it means to be obedient to God, and ultimately is to act as God's mouthpiece and to be a facilitator of God's law and God's will for the people. And then third, in Deuteronomy 18, there's the description of a prophet that they are to be waiting for. And unlike the description of judges and kings, though, this description is not written in a way that indicates that just any future prophet is being referenced here. Like judges and kings, that's just kind of a broad title that is going to apply to many people throughout the history of Israel. Not so with this prophet. This prophet that's being described, it's not Isaiah or Elijah or Jeremiah or the others, but this is a prophetic word about a specific prophet that will arise for the people down the line and speak God's word to his people. It says, I will raise up for them a prophet like Moses from among the Israelites, and I will put my words in his mouth. He will tell them everything I command them, and I myself will call to account anyone who does not listen to the words that prophet speaks in my name. And many scholars see this as a prophetic word about the Messiah, about the snake crusher, about the promised blessing to all nations that we've been waiting for since the book of Genesis. That one day, this prophet will come and make God's word and God's will plain to the people. As we read the book of Deuteronomy, it's almost as if God and Moses are trying to describe to the people exactly what Jesus is going to look like. He will be a good and just judge who looks out for the oppressed. He will be a true king over all the nations that is fully in line with God's desire for humanity, and he will be a prophet who comes and, like Moses, speaks the word of God directly to the hearts of the people. And it's not just like Moses, it's better than Moses. It's a new law and a new covenant that will come as a result. And why does it matter that man will come? Because it matters because God knows that the law of Moses is not going to work. He knows that Israel will fall short of the mark that he has set for them time and time and time again. But even centuries prior to Jesus' arriving, God's plan to give humanity a better and more permanent path back to right relationship with him is already falling into place. With Deuteronomy now coming to a close, the law may be complete. The Torah may have wrapped up. But God's full revelation to his people of himself for not only Israel, but for all of humanity, it's on the way. This full revelation of God is still coming. No wonder Jesus is such good news for all of humanity.